He called her broken and hollow before locking the door in the dead of winter. Then, a man with ink on his throat and power in his eyes said, "My children need a mother, and you need a kingdom. Come with me." If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's go back to hours before where it all started. The December snow fell like frozen ghosts over Chicago, each flake sharp enough to cut skin, cold enough to stop a heartbeat. The streets gleamed black and slick under the amber glow of streetlights, empty except for the wind that howled through alleyways and rattled the bones of the city. Somewhere, a car alarm shrieked and died. Somewhere else, laughter spilled from a bar and faded into the merciless night. At the corner of Ashland and Division, beneath the flickering yellow light of a bus shelter, a woman sat on a frosted bench with her knees drawn up, barefoot on concrete that burned with cold. She clutched a small red floral bag to her chest like it was the only proof she had ever existed. Her name was Eulalia Pinto, 31 years old, deep brown skin kissed by sun and scarred by cruelty. Natural curls thick and wild, dusted white with snowflakes that melted against the heat of shame still radiating from her body. Eyes the color of warm earth, now hollow and distant, staring at nothing and everything. A cream cardigan hung off her shoulders, soaked through and useless. The white tank top beneath clung to her shivering frame. Her jeans were damp at the knees where she had fallen twice, tried to walk away from the only home she had known for 7 years. But it had never been a home. Not really. Not when your husband stands in the doorway and calls you defective while neighbors pretend not to hear. Not when he throws your mother's quilt into the yard and tells you to take your barren womb somewhere it won't embarrass him anymore. That had been 6 hours ago, or maybe 8. Time had become a shapeless thing, measured only by the deepening ache in her chest and the numbness creeping up from her bare feet. Eulalia had been born in Port Harcourt, Nigeria, in a small house with blue shutters and a mango tree in the yard that her grandmother had planted the year independence came. Her mother used to tell her that the tree had grown strong because it had been watered with prayers and the tears of women who refused to break. Eulalia had believed her then. She had believed in a lot of things. That love was patient, that marriage was sacred, that a woman's worth was measured in more than the children she could bear. She had believed those things right up until the moment the doctor in the sterile white room told her that the scarring from the infection was irreversible, that her chances of conceiving were less than 5%, that she should consider herself fortunate to be alive at all after what her body had endured. Marcus hadn't been in the room when the doctor said it. He had been in the parking lot, on the phone with his mother, explaining why they would need to start looking into adoption or surrogacy, or maybe just accepting that God had other plans. But God's plans, it turned out, were not Marcus Pinto's plans. Within 3 months, the man who had promised to love her in sickness and in health had started sleeping in the guest room. Within 6 months, he stopped coming home for dinner. Within a year, he stopped pretending she existed at all except when he needed someone to blame for the emptiness in their house, for the silence at family gatherings, for the way his mother looked at Eulalia like she was a broken appliance that should have been returned for a refund. "You're not a real woman," Marcus had said to her once, drunk on whiskey and bitterness, his words slurred but precise enough to land like fists. "You're just taking up space." She had tried to leave him twice. The first time, she made it as far as her cousin's apartment in Gary, Indiana, before Marcus showed up with flowers and apologies and promises that things would be different. The second time, she made it to a women's shelter on the south side, but the shame of admitting that her marriage had failed, that she had failed, sent her crawling back within a week. The third time, she hadn't left at all. Marcus had done it for her. She remembered the morning with brutal clarity. It had been snowing then, too, the same thick, wet snow that turned the city into a postcard. She had been in the kitchen, making eggs the way Marcus liked them, scrambled with cheese and just enough pepper. She had been humming some old gospel song her mother used to sing while braiding her hair on Sunday mornings. Marcus had walked in wearing his work clothes, tie already knotted, shoes already polished, and the look on his face had told her everything before he even opened his mouth. I want you out, he had said. No preamble, no explanation, just 5 words that erased 7 years like they had never happened. Marcus, please, she had started, but he had held up a hand, the same hand that had once held hers during their vows, the same hand that had signed the lease on their first apartment, the same hand that had, in recent months, gripped her wrist hard enough to leave bruises. I'm done pretending, he said. My mother found someone, a woman from a church. She's young. She's fertile. She can give me what you can't. Eulalia had felt something crack inside her chest, something that sounded like glass breaking in slow motion. You're replacing me? I'm correcting a mistake, Marcus said, his voice flat and final. You have an hour to pack. After that, I'm changing the locks. She had looked at him, this man she had loved, this man she had built a life with, and realized she was staring at a stranger. Worse than a stranger. A stranger might have had the decency to feel guilty. Where am I supposed to go? She had asked, hating the way her voice shook. That's not my problem anymore. She had packed in 30 minutes. Threw whatever fit into the red floral bag her grandmother had given her for her 18th birthday. Left the rest. The dishes, the furniture, the framed photos of a smiling couple who no longer existed. She had stood in the doorway one last time, looking at the life she was leaving behind, and felt nothing. Not sadness, not anger, just a hollow, echoing emptiness. The neighbors had watched from their windows as she walked down the driveway, barefoot because Marcus had hidden her shoes, wearing only the clothes on her back because everything else felt too heavy to carry. Mrs. Chun from next door had opened her front door, started to say something, then closed it again when Eulalia shook her head. She didn't want pity, didn't want questions, didn't want anyone to witness the final dismantling of Eulalia Pinto, devoted wife, faithful woman, broken thing. So she had walked, through the snow, through the cold, through the city that suddenly felt like it belonged to everyone but her. She had walked until her soles bled, until she couldn't remember which direction she had come from, until the only thing left to do was sit down at this bus stop and wait for the cold to finish what her husband had started. Inside the floral bag, a photo of her mother, a silver ring her grandmother had worn, a hairbrush, a change of underclothes, the last shreds of a life she no longer recognized as her own. The wind howled. She pulled the cardigan tighter, but it was like wrapping herself in cobwebs. The cold was inside her now, settling in her marrow. Maybe this is how it ends, she thought. Maybe this is mercy. Then headlights. A sleek navy blue vehicle, low and powerful, slowed at the intersection. Not a taxi, not a bus. Something expensive. Something that didn't belong in this part of the city at this hour. The engine purred, smooth as a panther's growl, and the car stopped 20 feet from the shelter. The back door opened. Footsteps. Expensive leather shoes on wet pavement, steady and deliberate. The kind of walk that said the man wearing them had never been told no in his life and had no intention of starting now. Eulalia didn't look up. Men who stopped their cars in the dead of night rarely brought anything but trouble. But this man didn't speak right away. He stopped a few feet from the bench, close enough that she could see the shine of his black Oxfords in her peripheral vision, close enough that his presence filled the air like smoke. Then his voice, low, calm, edged with something between command and concern. You're going to die out here. Not a question, a fact. She didn't move. Her fingers tightened around the floral bag. I'm not interested in whatever you're selling, she said, her voice cracked and raw. I'm not selling anything. Silence stretched between them, heavy with snow and unspoken things. Slowly, she lifted her head. The man stood with his hands at his sides, no threat in his posture, but power in every inch of him. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a navy blue three-piece suit that looked like it had been tailored by angels and paid for by the devil. His black hair was slicked back, silver threading through the temples like frost on obsidian. His face was all sharp lines and controlled intensity, a jaw that could have been carved from marble, dark eyes that held no pity but something far more dangerous. Understanding, recognition, and on his neck, stark against olive skin, black geometric tattoos curved and coiled, a mandala on one side, Roman numerals on the other, the edge of something larger disappearing beneath his burgundy collar. He looked like violence dressed in silk, like a man who had built kingdoms on the bones of those who had underestimated him. "Why would you stop?" she asked, her voice brittle. "Why would you care?" He was quiet for a moment, his gaze dropping to her bare feet, to the bruises shadowing her wrist, to the way she held herself like she was trying to keep her ribs from cracking open. "Because," he said slowly, "I know what it looks like when someone's been thrown away." He shrugged off his long black wool coat and held it out to her. "And I know what it looks like when someone's surviving on spite alone." She stared at the coat, at the man holding it. "I don't need your pity." "Good," he said. "I'm not offering any." He draped the coat over her shoulders without touching her, the fabric still warm from his body, smelling of sandalwood and gunpowder and something she couldn't name. Something that felt like safety or danger pretending to be safety, or maybe both at once. "My name is Affiano Grease." The name landed like a stone in deep water. Everyone in Chicago knew that name, whispered it in the back rooms of restaurants, printed it in headlines that never quite told the whole story. Affiano Grease, the Silver Lion, the man who controlled half the city's underworld and all of its secrets. Eulalia's breath caught. "I know who you are," she whispered. "Then you know I don't make offers twice." He crouched down until his eyes were level with hers. This close, she could see the exhaustion etched into the corners of his mouth, the weight he carried in the set of his jaw. This was not a man who smiled often, but his eyes, dark as midnight, held something she hadn't expected. "Grief. I have 3 sons," he said quietly. "They lost their mother 2 years ago. I've given them everything, security, education, a fortress to keep the world out. But I can't give them what they need most." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "They need someone who knows what it's like to be broken and still choose to be kind. They need someone who understands that love isn't about blood. It's about showing up." Eulalia's throat tightened. "You don't know anything about me. I know you're barefoot in December and you're still breathing," Affiano said. "I know you haven't let go of that bag, even though your hands are shaking. I know someone told you that you weren't enough, and I know they were wrong." He stood, offering his hand. "My children need a mother, and you need a place where your worth isn't measured by what you can't do, but by what you choose to give." She stared at his hand, at the tattoos winding around his wrist, at the platinum watch that caught the streetlight and gleamed like a promise. "Why me?" "Because," Affiano said, his voice soft but unyielding, "when I look at you, I don't see someone who's broken. I see someone who survived. And survival is the rarest kind of strength." Snow fell between them, thick and silent. Behind him, the navy blue car waited, engine purring. Inside, she could see 3 small faces pressed against the tinted windows. Wide eyes, anxious and curious, watching the woman their father had stopped for in the middle of the frozen night. 3 boys who had lost their mother. 1 woman who had been told she could never be one. Affiano's hand remained steady in the air. "Come with me," he said, and for the first time in 6 hours, Eulalia Pinto felt something other than cold. She felt the faintest flicker of something that might have been hope, or maybe just the stubborn refusal to let the man who had discarded her have a last word. Her fingers, numb and trembling, reached out and took his hand. His grip was firm but careful, like he understood that she was made of glass and fractures. He pulled her to her feet with an ease that suggested he was used to carrying weight that didn't belong to him. The coat settled heavier around her shoulders, and for the first time in hours, Eulalia felt the trembling in her limbs begin to slow. Affiano gestured toward the car with a slight tilt of his head. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though her feet screamed in protest with the first step. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Men like him noticed everything. Without a word, he moved closer, offering his arm. She hesitated, then took it, leaning more heavily than she wanted to admit as they crossed the icy sidewalk. The car door stood open like a portal to another world. Warmth spilled out, along with the soft glow of interior lighting that made the leather seats look like melted chocolate. She climbed in, awkward and shivering, and sank into cushions that felt like clouds after the frozen concrete bench. Affiano slid in beside her, pulling the door shut with a solid, final thunk that sealed out the wind and the cold and the entire nightmare of the last 6 hours. The driver, a silent man with a shaved head and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, glanced in the rearview mirror. Affiano gave a single nod, and the car pulled away from the curb, smooth and soundless as a shadow. Only then did Eulalia notice the three boys. They sat in the row of seats, facing backward, wide-eyed and unnaturally still, studying her the way children study stray animals they're not sure they're allowed to touch. The oldest, maybe 5 or 6, had his father's dark eyes and a seriousness that didn't belong on a child's face. The middle one, lighter-skinned with curls that escaped from beneath his gray hood, chewed on his bottom lip and clutched the sleeve of the youngest boy beside him. The smallest, no more than 4, wore a puffy green parka 3 sizes too big and stared at Eulalia with a kind of unblinking intensity that made her wonder what he saw when he looked at her. "Boys," Affiano said, his voice softer than it had been on the street. "This is Miss Eulalia. She'll be staying with us." The oldest boy's gaze flicked to his father, then back to Eulalia. "For how long?" "As long as she wants to," Affiano replied. The middle child whispered something to his brother that Eulalia couldn't hear. The youngest just kept staring, his small hands buried in the oversized sleeves of his coat. Eulalia tried to smile, but her face felt frozen. "Hello," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. None of them answered. They just watched her with the wariness of children who had learned too young that people who came didn't always stay. The drive took 20 minutes, though it felt like seconds and hours at the same time. The city blurred past the tinted windows, streetlights and storefronts giving way to tree-lined roads and gated communities that Eulalia had only ever seen in magazines. The houses grew larger, the spaces between them wider, the walls higher. When the car finally stopped, it was in front of iron gates that looked like they could stop a tank. The driver pressed something on the dashboard, and the gates swung open with a mechanical whisper, revealing a driveway that curved through manicured gardens dusted with snow. And at the end of that driveway, the Grease estate rose like something out of a dream or a nightmare, depending on how you looked at it. It was massive, 3 stories of pale stone and dark wood, with tall windows that glowed gold against the night. Columns framed the entrance, and a fountain, currently still and frozen, sat in the center of the circular driveway. Everything about it screamed wealth and power and the kind of permanence that came from roots planted deep and watered with blood. Eulalia's breath caught. This wasn't a house. This was a fortress. The car stopped beneath a covered portico, and Affiano stepped out first, then turned to offer his hand again. She took it, stepping on cobblestones that had been cleared of snow, her bare feet shocking against the cold stone. One of the boys made a small sound of surprise, and Affiano's jaw tightened. "Antonio," he said, and the driver appeared at his side. "Get the doctor on the phone. Tell him I need him here within the hour." "Yes, sir." Affiano turned back to Eulalia, his dark eyes scanning her face. "Can you make it inside?" She wanted to say yes. Wanted to prove that she wasn't completely helpless, that taking his hand hadn't been a mistake. But her feet were bleeding, her body was shaking, and the adrenaline that had kept her upright was draining away like water through a sieve. "I think so," she whispered. He studied her for a moment, then made a decision. Before she could protest, he bent and scooped her in his arms, floral bag and all, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. Eulalia gasped, instinctively clutching at his shoulders. "Put your pride away," Affiano said, his voice low. "It won't keep you warm." He carried her up the steps, through double doors that swung open as if by magic, and into a foyer that stole what little breath she had left. The floors were white marble veined with gold, polished to a mirror shine. A chandelier the size of a small car hung from the vaulted ceiling, dripping crystal and light. A grand staircase curved upward to the left, its banister dark wood carved with intricate patterns. Paintings lined the walls, the kind that belonged to museums, and the air smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne and something else. Something clean and cold and utterly foreign. Silence filled the space like a living thing. Not the comfortable silence of a home, but the heavy, waiting silence of a mausoleum. The 3 boys filed in behind them, their footsteps echoing on the marble. They said nothing. They didn't run or shout or slam doors the way children should. They just stood there, small and watchful, like they were waiting for permission to exist. A woman appeared from a hallway to the right, older, with steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun and the kind of face that suggested she had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. She wore a simple black dress and sensible shoes, and when she saw Affiano carrying Eulalia, her eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Mr. Grease," she said, her voice crisp and accented with something Eastern European. "Shall I prepare the guest's suite?" "The Rose Room," Affiano said, "and bring warm water, bandages, clean clothes. The doctor will be here soon." The woman's gaze flicked to Eulalia, taking in the soaked cardigan, the bare feet, the floral bag clutched like a lifeline. Something flickered across her face, too quick to name, then vanished behind professional composure. "Of course, sir." She turned on her heel and disappeared down the hallway, her footsteps brisk and efficient. Affiano carried Eulalia up the staircase, his movements steady and unhurried, as though carrying broken women through his fortress was something he did every day. The boys followed at a distance, a silent procession of small shadows. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched in both directions, lined with closed doors and paintings of stern-faced men who might have been ancestors or enemies. Affiano turned left, then stopped in front of a door near the end of the hall. He nudged it open with his shoulder and stepped inside. The room was beautiful. Soft gray walls, a four-poster bed draped in white linens that looked like clouds, a fireplace already crackling with flames that bathed everything in warm, golden light. Thick rugs covered the hardwood floor. A sitting area near the windows held 2 chairs and a small table. Everything was tasteful, expensive, and utterly impersonal. Affiano set her down on the edge of the bed as carefully as if she were made of porcelain. The mattress gave beneath her, impossibly soft after hours on frozen concrete. "The doctor will check your feet," he said, straightening. "Mrs. Kovac will bring you clothes. There's a bathroom through that door. Everything you need is already there." Eulalia nodded, unable to find words. She looked around the room, at the luxury that surrounded her, and felt more out of place than she had sitting in the snow. Affiano moved toward the door, then paused, his hand on the frame. He turned back, and for a moment, something unguarded crossed his face. Something that might have been regret or recognition or simply exhaustion. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Whatever you left behind, whatever broke you, it doesn't exist inside these walls." Then he was gone, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a promise or prison sentence. Eulalia sat alone in the Rose Room of the Grease estate, surrounded by marble and silk and golden light, and realized she had traded her soaked cardigan for the safety of a fortress. She just wasn't sure yet what the price would be. The doctor came and went within the hour, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that moved with clinical efficiency. He cleaned and bandaged her feet, muttered something about frostbite and minor lacerations, left antibiotics and pain medication on the nightstand, and departed without asking a single question about how she'd ended up barefoot in December. Men in Affiano's employ, it seemed, knew better than to ask questions. Mrs. Kovac had brought clothes while the doctor worked. Soft gray lounge pants, a cream-colored sweater that felt like cashmere, thick socks, and undergarments still in their packaging. Everything fit perfectly, as though someone had measured her by sight alone. The efficiency of it all was unsettling. Eulalia had bathed in water so hot it turned her skin pink, scrubbing away the grime and cold until she felt almost human again. Almost. The mirror had shown her a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt, a woman who looked like she'd survived something but hadn't yet decided if survival was worth celebrating. Now she sat on the edge of the bed, clean and warm and utterly lost, staring at the flames in the fireplace and wondering what came next. The house beyond her door was silent. Not peaceful, just silent, like the air itself was holding its breath. A soft knock interrupted the quiet. Eulalia turned toward the door, her heart suddenly hammering. Yes. The door opened a crack, and a small face appeared in the gap. The oldest boy, His dark eyes studied her with the same intensity they had in the car, measuring, calculating, deciding. "Can we come in?" he asked, his voice careful and formal, like he'd been taught to ask permission for everything. Eulalia straightened, pulling the sweater down over her bandaged hands. "Of course." He pushed the door open wider, and the three boys filed in like soldiers on a mission. The oldest led, shoulders squared despite his small frame. The middle child followed close behind, one hand clutching his brother's shirt. The youngest came last, still swimming in that oversized green parka, his small face barely visible beneath the hood. They stopped a few feet from the bed, standing in a line, and stared at her. Eulalia tried to smile. "Hello again." The oldest boy didn't return the smile. "Papa said we should introduce ourselves properly. I'm Dante. I'm 6. He said it like he was reporting for duty, like being 6 was a rank he'd earned. The middle child shifted his weight from foot to foot, his curls bouncing slightly. "I'm Luca. I'm 4.5. He glanced at his older brother, as if checking whether he'd said the right thing. The youngest said nothing. He just stood there, hands buried in the parka's sleeves, staring at Eulalia with eyes that were too old for his face. "And what's your name?" Eulalia asked gently, directing her attention to the smallest boy. He didn't answer, didn't even blink. "That's Nico," Dante said, his tone flat. "He doesn't talk much. Sometimes not at all." "He used to talk," Luca added quietly, his voice carrying a sadness that made Eulalia's chest ache. "Before Mama died." The words hung in the air like smoke. Eulalia's throat tightened. She looked at Nico, at the way he seemed to be trying to disappear inside the parka, and recognized something she'd seen in her own reflection not 2 hours ago. The look of someone who'd learned that the world could take everything and leave you with nothing but the need to make yourself small. "It's nice to meet all of you," Eulalia said softly. "Dante, Luca, Nico. Those are strong names." Dante's expression didn't change. "Papa says you're going to stay here, that you're going to take care of us." It wasn't a question. It was a test. "If you'll let me," Eulalia said carefully. "I know I'm a stranger. I know you don't know me. But I promise I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm just here to help." "Nobody can replace Mama," Lucas said, his voice suddenly fierce despite its smallness. "Nobody." "You're right," Eulalia agreed. "Nobody can. Your Mama was yours, and she always will be." Dante studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp and assessing. He had his father's eyes, she realized. Not just the color, but the weight behind them. The look of someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast. "Are you going to leave?" he asked finally. The question hit harder than it should have. Eulalia thought about Marcus, about the women's shelter, about every time she tried to build something only to watch it crumble. About how she'd spent 7 years being told she wasn't enough, and now 3 small boys were asking her if she was going to abandon them too. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said honestly. It wasn't the answer they wanted, maybe, but it was the truth. "And even if I did, I wouldn't leave unless you wanted me to." Dante considered this. Then, slowly he nodded. "Okay." Luca looked between his brother and Eulalia, his expression uncertain but hopeful. "Do you know how to make pancakes?" The question was so unexpected that Eulalia almost laughed. "I do, actually. My mother taught me when I was about your age. Mama made them on Sundays," Lucas said quietly. "But Mrs. Kovac says they're too much trouble during the week." "Mrs. Kovac makes good food," Dante interjected quickly, like he was defending the housekeeper's honor. "It's just different." Eulalia understood what he wasn't saying. Nothing was the same anymore. Not the food, not the house, not their lives. They were 3 boys living in a fortress, trying to remember what normal felt like. "Maybe we could make pancakes together sometime," Eulalia offered. "If your papa says it's okay." Luca's face brightened slightly. Even Dante's expression softened, just a fraction. But Nico still hadn't moved, still hadn't spoken. He stood there in his oversized parka, the hood pulled so far forward that his face was half hidden in shadow, and Eulalia wondered what he was thinking, what he was feeling, whether he felt anything at all anymore, or if grief had hollowed him out the way it had tried to hollow her. She slid off the bed carefully, wincing slightly as her bandaged feet touched the floor, and lowered herself to her knees, so she was at eye level with the smallest boy. The movement brought her close enough to see the details. The way his hands were balled into fists inside the sleeves, the slight tremble in his shoulders, the dried tear tracks on his cheeks that someone had tried to wipe away but hadn't quite managed. "Nico," she said softly, "that's a beautiful parka. It looks very warm." He blinked. It was the first sign of life she'd seen from him. "It was Mama's," Dante said from behind her. "Her winter jacket. Papa had it taken in for Nico, but Nico won't let anyone fix it properly. He likes it big, because it still smelled like her," Eulalia realized. Because wearing something 3 sizes too big meant he could wrap himself in the memory of his mother's arms. Because grief was easier to carry when you could hide inside it. "I think," Eulalia said carefully, "that it fits perfectly." Nico's eyes, so dark they were almost black, met hers. For a moment, something flickered there. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. The acknowledgement that she saw him, really saw him, and wasn't going to try to fix what was broken. He didn't speak, but he took one small step closer. It wasn't much, but it was something. "We should let you rest," Dante said, his voice cutting through the moment with practiced authority. "The doctor said you needed to stay off your feet." Luca nodded and started backing toward the door, but his eyes stayed on Eulalia, hopeful and wary in equal measure. Nico lingered a heartbeat longer, then turned and followed his brothers, the parka swishing around his small frame like a green ghost. At the door, Dante paused and looked back. "Miss Eulalia?" "Yes." "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not lying to us." Then they were gone, the door clicking shut behind them, leaving Eulalia alone once more with the fire and the silence and the realization that she'd just met 3 boys who'd had their hearts broken by death and were terrified she'd break what was left. She climbed back onto the bed, pulled her knees to her chest, and stared at the door where they'd stood. 3 lost boys in a fortress built to keep the world out, and 1 lost woman who'd just promised not to leave. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like stones. But Eulalia had carried stones before, had carried the weight of a failing marriage, the shame of her body's betrayal, the crushing silence of a house that blamed her for its emptiness. These stones, at least, came with small faces and cautious hope. These stones, she thought, might be worth carrying. She stayed off her feet for 2 days as the doctor ordered, spending the time staring out the window at snow-covered gardens and trying to map the sounds of the house. Footsteps at 7 in the morning, always the same pattern. Affiano's measured stride, then the lighter patter of small feet being herded toward breakfast. Mrs. Kovac's efficient movements in the hallway. The creak of doors opening and closing. Silence. So much silence. On the 3rd morning, Eulalia woke before dawn, her feet tender but healing, and made a decision. She couldn't stay locked in the Rose room forever, wrapped in expensive sheets and uncertainty. If she was going to be here, she was going to keep the promise she'd made to 3 grieving boys. She needed to do more than just exist in their space. She needed to bring life back to this mausoleum. The kitchen, when she found it, was massive and gleaming, all stainless steel and marble countertops that looked like they'd never seen a real meal prepared on them. Mrs. Kovac stood at the industrial stove, stirring something in a pot, her movements precise and joyless. She turned when Eulalia entered, her expression carefully neutral. "Miss Pinto, you should be resting." "I've rested enough," Eulalia said. "I'd like to help with breakfast, if that's all right." Mrs. Kovac's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Help? I used to cook," Eulalia said. "Before. I'm not trying to step on your toes, Mrs. Kovac. I just need to do something with my hands." The older woman studied her for a long moment, and Eulalia braced herself for rejection. But then Mrs. Kovac nodded toward the refrigerator. "The boys eat oatmeal on weekdays. Mr. Grease drinks black coffee and nothing else until noon. If you want to make something additional, I won't stop you." It wasn't warm, but it wasn't a no. Eulalia opened the refrigerator and found it stocked like a restaurant. Fresh vegetables, fruits, meats, dairy organized with military precision. She pulled out eggs, milk, flour from the pantry, vanilla extract. Her hands moved on muscle memory, measuring and mixing, while Mrs. Kovac watched from the corner of her eye. The pancake batter came together smooth and golden. Eulalia heated a pan, added butter, watched it foam and sizzle. The first pancake hit the griddle with a satisfying hiss, and the smell began to fill the kitchen. Sweet, warm, the kind of smell that made a house feel like a home. Mrs. Kovac paused in her stirring. The boys haven't had pancakes since their mother died. Luca mentioned that. Eulalia said quietly, flipping the pancake. Perfect golden brown. I thought maybe it was time. Time, Mrs. Kovac repeated, her voice softer than before. Perhaps. By the time the boys arrived for breakfast, Eulalia had a stack of pancakes waiting, still warm, with butter melting on top. Dante entered first, as always, his posture straight and cautious. Luca followed, then Nico in his oversized parka, put up despite being indoors. All three stopped in the doorway when they saw Eulalia at the stove. Good morning, she said, trying to keep her voice light. I made pancakes. I hope that's okay. Luca's eyes went wide. You really made them? I promised, didn't I? He looked at his brothers, seeking permission. Dante studied the stack of pancakes like they might be a trap, then gave a small nod. Luca rushed to the table, climbing into his chair with an eagerness that made Eulalia's chest ache. Even Nico moved a little faster, though his expression remained unreadable behind the shadow of his hood. Eulalia served them, one pancake each to start, and watched as they ate. Luca devoured his in seconds, syrup on his chin, grinning wider than she'd seen yet. Dante ate more carefully, methodically, but she noticed the way his shoulders relaxed with each bite. Nico ate slowly, cutting tiny pieces, but he ate. He ate. These are good, Dante said finally, and coming from him, it sounded like a benediction. Can we have more? Luca asked, already holding up his plate. As many as you want, Eulalia said, and meant it. She made pancakes every morning that week, and slowly, incrementally, the kitchen began to feel less like a showroom and more like a place where people lived. Mrs. Kovac started leaving ingredients out for her without being asked. The boys started appearing earlier, drawn by the smell of butter and vanilla. Even Affiano, who claimed to eat nothing before noon, began stopping in the kitchen doorway on his way out, coffee in hand, watching his sons eat with something that might have been relief in his dark eyes. He never said anything, just watched, then left. But Eulalia felt his attention like sunlight through clouds. The afternoons were harder. The boys had tutors who came and went, leaving them with worksheets and reading assignments that they completed in silence in the library. Eulalia would find them scattered around the vast room, each boy in his own corner, working alone even though they were in the same space. On the fifth day, she found Luca crying quietly over a math problem, his small hands balled into fists, try to muffle his frustration so his brothers wouldn't hear. She knelt beside him, careful of her still tender feet. What's wrong, sweetheart? I can't do it, he whispered, his voice thick with tears. The numbers don't make sense, and Dante's already done, and I'm stupid. You're not stupid, Eulalia said firmly. You're 4.5. These numbers are hard. Mama used to help me, Lucas said, and his voice cracked on the word. She'd sing the counting song, and then it was easier. Eulalia's throat tightened. Do you remember the song? He shook his head, fresh tears spilling. I forgot her voice. The devastation in those words was total. Eulalia reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and when he didn't, she gathered him into her lap. He came willingly, burying his face in her shoulder, and sobbed. It's okay to forget, Eulalia whispered into his curls. It doesn't mean you loved her less. It just means time is doing what time does. But we can make new songs. Would you like that? Luca nodded against her shoulder. So Eulalia began to hum. An old Nigerian lullaby her mother had sung to her. The words in Igbo that she barely remembered, but the melody as familiar as breathing. She rocked gently, letting the tune fill the silence, and felt Luca's breathing slow, his small body relaxing into hers. When she finished, she started again, but this time with counting woven in. 1, 2, 3 little birds in a tree. 4, 5, 6 picking up little sticks. Luca lifted his head, his eyes red but clearer. That's silly. It's very silly, Eulalia agreed. But does it help? He considered, then nodded. Can you sing it again? She did, over and over until the numbers made sense. Until Luca completed his worksheet with a triumphant grin. And when she looked up, she found Nico standing in the doorway, watching, his hood finally pushed back so she could see his whole face. He didn't speak, but he stayed. That evening, Eulalia made jollof rice for dinner, the smell of tomatoes and spices and memory filling the kitchen until even Mrs. Kovac came to investigate. The boys ate with an enthusiasm that bordered on reverence, and when Affiano arrived home late, drawn by the unfamiliar scents, he stood in the doorway and stared at his sons laughing at the table. "What is this?" he asked, and his voice carried something fragile. "Dinner," Eulalia said simply. "Would you like some?" He looked at her for a long moment, those dark eyes searching for something. Then he nodded and took a seat at the table with his children for the first time in what she suspected was months. They ate. They talked haltingly at first, then easier. Luca told a story about a bird he'd seen in the garden. Dante corrected his brother's facts with the patience of an expert. Nico sat in his parka and listened, and twice, Eulalia could have sworn she saw the ghost of a smile. When the meal ended and the boys were sent to wash up for bed, Affiano lingered at the table, his fingers wrapped around a glass of water. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for dinner, for making them remember what this felt like," he said, gesturing to the empty plates, the crumbs, the evidence of life. "I'd forgotten too." Eulalia met his gaze and saw the same grief she'd seen in Nico's eyes. The same desperate need to make the pain smaller by making himself smaller. "You don't have to forget her to let them live again," Eulalia said softly. "There's room for both." Affiano said nothing, but when he stood to leave, he paused beside her chair. "You're good for them," he said. "For us." Then he was gone, leaving Eulalia alone in the kitchen with the dishes and the lingering smell of home and the understanding that healing wasn't loud. It was pancakes and counting songs and the slow, steady work of teaching broken hearts that they were allowed to beat again. 3 weeks passed in this rhythm. Eulalia found her place in the fortress, not by demanding it, but by filling the spaces no one else knew were empty. She learned that Dante liked his toast dark, almost burnt, that Luca needed someone to check under his bed each night before he could sleep, that Nico would sit beside her while she cooked, silent but present, the green parka a constant companion. The house began to shift around her, not loudly, not obviously, but in small, essential ways. Laughter in the kitchen, the smell of bread baking on Sunday mornings, the sound of Luca's voice carrying through the hallways as he practiced his counting songs. Even Mrs. Kovac softened, teaching Eulalia how the house liked things done while sharing stories about the boys when they were smaller, when their mother was still alive. But Affiano remained a shadow. He appeared for dinner most nights now, present but distant, watching his sons come back to life with something like wonder and something like pain. He spoke little, asked even less. When Eulalia met his eyes across the table, she saw a man who had built walls so high he'd forgotten how to climb back down. Until the night she found him alone in the library. It was late, well past midnight. Eulalia had come downstairs for water, unable to sleep despite the comfortable bed and the safety of locked doors. Old habits died hard. She still woke, sometimes expecting to find Marcus standing over her, drunk and mean, telling her all the ways she'd failed. The library door was cracked open, warm light spilling into the dark hallway. She should have walked past, should have respected his privacy. But something made her pause, made her look inside. Affiano sat in a leather chair near the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in one hand, his gaze fixed on the flames. He'd removed his suit jacket, rolled his sleeves to his elbows, and loosened his tie. Without the armor of his tailored clothes, he looked smaller somehow. Not diminished, but human, tired. The firelight played across the tattoos on his neck and forearms, turning the black ink to gold and shadow. He spoke without turning. "You can come in, Eulalia. I know you're there." She hesitated, then pushed the door open wider. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not," he said, and gestured to the chair across from his. "Sit, if you want." She crossed the room, her footsteps muffled by thick carpet, and lowered herself into the chair. The fire was warm, the room quiet except for the pop and hiss of burning wood. They sat in silence for a moment, and Eulalia realized this was the first time they'd been alone together since the night he'd found her at the bus stop. "You've been good for them," Affiano said finally, still watching the fire. "Better than I expected." "They're good boys," Eulalia replied. "They just needed someone to see them. And you do. See them." It wasn't a question. "Yes." He took a slow sip of his drink, then set the glass down on the side table with careful precision. "Dante told me you helped Luca with his mathematics. That you sang to him. He was struggling. I just gave him a different way to think about the numbers. His mother used to do the same thing," Affiano said quietly. "Sing to them when they were frustrated or afraid. I'd forgotten that until Dante mentioned it." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but it was there, sharp and deep beneath the surface. "What was her name?" Eulalia asked gently. "Your wife." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, softly, Isabella. The name hung in the air between them like a ghost. "She was everything I wasn't," Affiano continued, his gaze still fixed on the flames. "Kind, patient. She saw good in the world, even when I showed her all the reasons there wasn't any. She knew what I did, and she loved me anyway." His jaw tightened. "I never understood why." "Maybe because you gave her reasons to," Eulalia said. He turned to look at her then, those dark eyes searching. "You don't know what I've done. The things I do to keep this family safe." "No," Eulalia agreed. "But I know what you did for me, and I know what you're doing for your sons. That counts for something." Affiano's expression shifted, something unreadable passing across his features. He reached up, fingers brushing the tattoo on the left side of his neck. The mandala, intricate and geometric, perfect circles within circles. "Do you know what this means?" he asked. Eulalia shook her head. "Balance," he said. "Order within chaos. I got it the day Isabella told me she was pregnant with Dante. She said if I was going to bring a child into this world, into my world, I needed to understand that I couldn't control everything, that some things required surrender." His fingers traced the pattern. She was right. Being a father meant letting go of certainty, trusting that love would be enough even when logic said it wouldn't. He dropped his hand, then touched the other side of his neck where Roman numerals were inked in bold, elegant script. These are the dates they were born. Dante, Luca, Nico. The 3 days that mattered more than any deal I've ever made, any territory I've ever claimed. "And the lion?" Eulalia asked, nodding toward the partial image that disappeared beneath his collar. His expression darkened. "That one's older, from before Isabella. A reminder that in my world, you're either predator or prey, and I decided a long time ago which one I'd be." He paused. Isabella hated it, said it made me look like I was trying too hard to be dangerous. She was the only person who ever dared to mock me. Despite the heaviness of the conversation, Eulalia found herself almost smiling. "She sounded like she kept you honest. She kept me human," Affiano corrected. "Without her, I'm just the lion, just a business, just a thing people fear in the dark." "That's not what your sons see," Eulalia said firmly. "They see their father. They see someone who's trying, even when it's hard. They see someone who failed them," Affiano said, his voice rough. "Isabella died because of me, because of what I am. She was targeted, Eulalia, taken to send a message, to make me weak." His hands curled into fists. "It worked. I found her too late, and by then..." He stopped, jaw working, the firelight catching the wetness in his eyes that he refused to let fall. "By then she was gone," he finished quietly, "and I had to come home and tell 3 boys that their mother was never coming back. That she died because their father made enemies who don't care about collateral damage." Eulalia's chest ached. She thought about Nico's silence, Luca's clinging neediness, Dante's forced maturity. 3 boys who'd lost their mother to violence and their father to grief. "You're still here," she said softly. "You're still trying. That's not failure, Affiano. That's survival." "Is it?" He looked at her, and the vulnerability in his expression nearly broke her. "Because most days it feels like I'm just going through motions, keeping them safe, but not knowing how to make them happy. Giving them everything except the one thing they actually need, which is Someone who knows how to love them without being afraid that love will get them killed. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Eulalia leaned forward slightly. Love doesn't make you weak. It made Isabella strong enough to choose you despite everything. It made you strong enough to keep going after losing her. And it's making your sons strong enough to heal. And you, Affiano asked, his gaze intense, what made you strong enough to take a stranger's hand in the middle of the night? Spite, mostly, Eulalia said, and was surprised when he laughed. A short, rough sound, but real. And maybe the understanding that sometimes survival means trusting people you have no reason to trust. That's a dangerous philosophy in my world. I'm learning, Eulalia said, that your world isn't as different from mine as you think. We've both lost things. We're both trying to figure out how to keep going. The only difference is your walls are made of stone and mine were made of shame. Affiano studied her for a long moment, then stood. He moved to the fireplace, bracing one hand against the mantel, his back to her. I brought you here for my sons, he said quietly. But I think you might be saving more than just them. Before Eulalia could respond, he straightened, the vulnerability sliding away behind the mask of control he wore so well. It's late, he said. You should rest. It was a dismissal, but a gentle one. Eulalia rose from her chair. As she passed him on her way to the door, she paused. Affiano. He turned slightly, just enough to meet her eyes. Isabella was right, Eulalia said. Love is enough, even when logic says it isn't. Especially then. She left him standing by the fire, surrounded by shadows and memory, the lion and the mandala both visible in the flickering light. And for the first time since arriving at the Greece estate, Eulalia understood that she wasn't just healing 3 lost boys. She was healing their father too. The realization sat heavy in her chest for days after their conversation in the library. Affiano didn't mention that night, and neither did she, but something had shifted between them. He lingered longer at breakfast now, asked her opinion on small things, whether Dante seemed too serious for his age, if Luca's nightmares were getting better, what she thought Nico needed that they weren't giving him. He trusted her, with his children, with his grief, with the parts of himself he kept hidden from everyone else. Eulalia told herself that was enough, that she was here to heal, not to want. But late at night, when the house was quiet, she'd remember the firelight on his tattoos, the rawness in his voice when he spoke about Isabella, and feel something dangerous unfurling in her chest. It was Mrs. Kovac who delivered the news on a Tuesday morning while Eulalia was teaching Nico how to crack eggs without getting shell in the bowl. The smallest boy still hadn't spoken, but he'd started helping in the kitchen, his small hands careful and deliberate as he worked beside her. Mr. Grease wants you to know there will be guests for dinner tonight, Mrs. Kovac said, her tone clipped and professional. Important guests. He's requested you join them. Eulalia looked up from the mixing bowl, surprised. Me? Why? He didn't say. But when Mr. Grease requests something, we don't ask why. We simply comply. Mrs. Kovac's expression softened slightly. We're something appropriate. The navy dress I put in your closet last week will do. I don't understand. I'm not part of his business. Tonight you are, Mrs. Kovac said, whether you want to be or not. She left before Eulalia could protest further, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Nico tugged on Eulalia's sleeve, his dark eyes questioning. It's all right, sweetheart, Eulalia said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Your papa just wants me to meet some people. But the knot in her stomach told her it was more than that. The navy dress fit perfectly, as everything Mrs. Kovac provided did. It was simple but elegant, falling just below her knees, with long sleeves and a modest neckline that somehow made her feel both protected and exposed. She'd pulled her natural curls back into a low bun, the way her mother used to wear hers for church, and stared at her reflection, wondering who this woman was. Not the girl from Port Harcourt, not Marcus's discarded wife. Someone new, someone she was still trying to recognize. At 7 o'clock, she descended the grand staircase and found Affiano waiting in the foyer. He wore a black suit that looked like it cost more than a car, crisp white shirt, no tie. His hair was perfectly styled, the silver at his temples catching the light from the chandelier. But it was his expression that stopped her halfway down the stairs. He looked different, harder. The gentle father who made space at the dinner table had been replaced by something colder, more calculating. The lion, not the man. His eyes swept over her, assessing, and for a moment something flickered in his expression. Approval, maybe, or surprise. "You look appropriate," he said, which was about as close to a compliment as Eulalia expected from this version of him. "Mrs. Kovac chose well," Eulalia replied, reaching the bottom of the stairs. "Though I still don't understand why I'm here." "Because I want them to see you," Affiano said simply. "I want them to understand that this house is no longer just mine, that there are people here worth respecting." Before she could ask what that meant, the doorbell rang. Antonio, the Scar driver who doubled as security, opened the door to reveal 4 men. They entered like predators assessing new territory, confident, watchful, dangerous in ways that didn't require weapons to be obvious. 3 of them were older, in their 50s or 60s, wearing expensive suits and expressions of practiced neutrality. The 4th was younger, maybe 40, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging exits and threats. "Gentlemen," Affiano said, his voice smooth and cold as winter water. "Welcome." They exchanged greetings in Italian, words Eulalia didn't understand but could feel the weight of. These were not friends. This was business. The kind of business that explained the fortress walls and the armed security and the way Affiano's sons had learned to be quiet. Affiano turned to her, his hand settling lightly on the small of her back, and the touch sent electricity up her spine. "This is Eulalia Pinto," he said in English now. "She manages my household and cares for my children." The way he said it made it sound like a position of power rather than service, like she was someone who mattered. The oldest of the men, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, studied her with undisguised curiosity. "Pinto, Nigerian?" "Yes," Eulalia said, keeping her voice steady though her heart hammered. "And you live here?" "In Greece's home." There was an implication in the question that made her skin crawl. Affiano's hand pressed slightly firmer against her back, a warning or a reassurance. She wasn't sure which. "She does," Affiano said, his tone allowing no room for speculation. "She is under my protection, completely." The word carried weight. The men heard it, their expressions shifting infinitesimally. Protection in this world, Eulalia was learning, meant more than safety. It meant ownership, territory, a line no one crossed. They moved to the dining room, a cavernous space Eulalia had never seen used. The table could seat 20, but was set for 6 tonight, crystal and china gleaming under an ornate chandelier. Mrs. Kovac had prepared a meal that looked like art, courses that arrived with perfect timing, wine that probably cost more than Eulalia had made in a month at her old job. Eulalia sat beside Affiano, hyper-aware of his presence, of the way the other men watched her when they thought she wasn't looking. The conversation flowed around her in English and Italian, talk of territories and shipments and disagreements that needed resolving. Nothing was said explicitly, but the implications were clear. These men controlled things, moved things, decided who lived and who didn't with the same casual authority they used to order wine. And Affiano was one of them. No, more than that. They deferred to him, waited for his opinions, watched him for cues like courtiers watching a king. This was the man who had carried her barefoot into his home, who made space at the dinner table for his sons, who had shown her his tattoos and told her about Isabella's mockery and his own failures. But it was also a man who could end lives with a phone call, who had enemies that killed innocent women to make points, who wore violence like other men wore cologne. The younger man with the scar, introduced as Enzo, leaned forward during the second course. "I heard you lost your shipment from Santos, Greece. That must have been disappointing." His tone was sympathetic, but his eyes were predatory. Affiano's expression didn't change. "Disappointing is when you burn dinner. What happened in Santos was theft, and theft has consequences." "Of course," Enzo said quickly. "I only meant to offer assistance, if you needed resources to handle it." "I don't," Affiano replied. His voice was pleasant, conversational. but something that made Enzo sit back, his smile faltering. The situation has been resolved. Permanently. Eulalia's stomach turned. Resolved. Permanently. She understood what that meant. The silver-haired man, Carmine, changed the subject smoothly. Your sons. They're doing well. Affiano's expression softened fractionally. They are. Thanks in large part to Miss Pinto. It must be difficult, Carmine continued, raising boys without their mother, especially in our line of work. It is, Affiano agreed, which is why I've made changes. This house is no longer just a base of operations. It's a home. My children will grow up knowing there's more to life than the business. The men exchanged glances. This was news to them, news that clearly made them uncomfortable. A noble sentiment, Carmine said carefully. But in our world, Greece, softness is often mistaken for weakness. Affiano's hand found his wineglass. His fingers relaxed and casual, but Eulalia saw the tension in his jaw. I'm not soft, Carmine. I'm deliberate. There's a difference. My children will be protected, educated, and loved. Anyone who mistakes that for weakness is welcome to test the theory. The threat hung in the air like smoke. No one tested it. The dinner ended with handshakes and pleasantries that fooled no one. When the men were gone, ushered out by Antonio, Affiano stood in the foyer with his hands in his pockets, staring at the closed door. Eulalia stood beside him, still processing what she'd witnessed. That's who you are, she said quietly. Out there, in your world. Yes, Affiano replied. And in here, with your sons? He turned to look at her, and the mask cracked enough for her to see the exhaustion beneath. In here, I try to be someone worthy of the second chance you're giving them. Giving me. It's not a second chance if you're still the same person, Eulalia said. I know, Affiano said. That's why I'm trying to change. For them. For. He stopped, then continued more carefully. For this. Whatever this is. He gestured to the house, but Eulalia suspected he meant something more. They need to see both sides, she said. Your sons. They need to understand the world you come from, so they can choose whether to follow you into it or find another path. And you? Affiano asked. Now that you've seen what I really am, do you still want to stay? Eulalia thought about the men at the table. The implied violence. The weight of Affiano's power and all it required. She thought about 3 boys who needed her, and a man who was trying, clumsily and desperately, to be better than his nature. I'm still here, she said, and she was. The days that followed the dinner settled into a new rhythm. Affiano was gentler with her, as if her acceptance of his darker half had earned her something beyond gratitude. He touched her more, a hand on her shoulder when he passed in the hallway, fingers brushing hers when he handed her his coffee cup at breakfast, small intimacies that felt larger than they were. The boys noticed. Dante watched them with his 2 old eyes, calculating, assessing. Luca grinned whenever his father and Eulalia were in the same room, as if he'd orchestrated something magical. And Nico, still silent, had started sitting between them at dinner, his small body a bridge connecting 2 people who were learning to be more than strangers. It was Luca who'd asked to go to the park. Please, Miss Eulalia, he'd begged, his hands clasped together like prayer. We never go anywhere. Dante says it's too dangerous, but we have Antonio and the others. Papa wouldn't let anything happen. Dante had looked skeptical, but hadn't argued, which Eulalia took as tacit approval. Even Nico had perked up at the mention of outside, his hood slipping back just enough to show his interest. So she'd asked Affiano, half expecting him to refuse. But he'd surprised her. Take Antonio and Marco, he'd said. Stay where they can see you. Don't talk to anyone you don't know. And Eulalia, his dark eyes had held hers. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you leave. Immediately. Now, standing in Millennium Park with 3 boys and 2 armed men trying to look like casual bodyguards, Eulalia wondered if she should have pushed harder for safety or given in faster to the boys' need for normalcy. The park was beautiful in late January, the famous bean sculpture reflecting a winter sky that threatened snow but hadn't yet delivered. Families wandered the paths, bundled in coats and scarves, their breath fogging in the cold air. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that the woman with 3 mixed-race boys and 2 very alert companions was part of a world they only saw in movies. Luca ran ahead, his laughter cutting through the cold, while Dante walked beside Eulalia with measured steps. Nico held her hand, his grip tight, the green parka making him look even smaller than he was. Antonio followed 10 feet behind, his eyes constantly scanning, while Marco positioned himself ahead, casual but watchful. "Can we get hot chocolate?" Luca called back. "Mama used to get us hot chocolate with marshmallows." "Of course," Eulalia called back, and felt Nico's hand squeeze hers. They were heading toward a vendor cart when Eulalia felt it. That prickling awareness that came from being watched. Not the professional observation of Antonio and Marco, but something else. Something familiar and wrong. She turned, scanning the crowd, and her heart stopped. Marcus. He stood near a bench 30 feet away, wearing a black coat she recognized, his expression fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He looked thinner than she remembered, harder, but it was definitely him. The man who'd called her broken, who'd thrown her out into the snow, who'd convinced her she was worthless. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. Then he started walking toward her. "Antonio," Eulalia said quietly, her voice remarkably steady considering her pulse was hammering. The man in the black coat. Heading this way. Antonio's attention sharpened immediately. He moved closer, his hand sliding inside his jacket in a way that was both subtle and unmistakable. Marco had already repositioned, cutting off the most direct angle of approach. Marcus stopped 10 feet away, his gaze moving from Eulalia to the boys to the 2 men who had materialized like wolves sensing threat. "Eulalia," he said, and his voice was the same. That tone of disappointment and condescension she'd lived with for 7 years. "I've been looking for you. How did you find me?" The question came out sharper than she intended. "You're not as invisible as you think," Marcus replied. "Someone saw you getting into an expensive car with children. In this neighborhood." It wasn't hard to piece together. His eyes narrowed. "What are you doing, Eulalia?" "Playing nanny for some rich family." "That's none of your business," she said. Luca had stopped running and now stood beside Dante, both boys watching with wide eyes. Nico pressed closer to Eulalia, his small body trembling. Marcus noticed the boys. His expression twisted into something ugly. "These aren't yours. They can't be. So what? You're raising someone else's kids now? Making them call you mother? That's sick, Eulalia. Even for you." "Don't," Eulalia said, her voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare speak about these children." "Why not? They should know what kind of woman you are. A woman who can't give her husband children, but plays house with someone else's." Marcus took a step closer, and immediately Antonio moved between them, his presence a wall. "That's close enough," Antonio said, his accent thick but his English clear. Marcus looked at Antonio, at Marco who had closed in from the other side, and something like fear flickered in his eyes. But pride or stupidity pushed him forward. "I'm talking to my wife," Marcus said. "Ex-wife," Eulalia corrected, finding her voice. "You threw me out, remember? Changed the locks. Told me I wasn't your problem anymore. I made a mistake," Marcus said, and the words were so absurd Eulalia almost laughed. "My mother convinced me, but I've had time to think. We can fix this. You can come home." "Home," Eulalia repeated. "You mean the place where you made me feel worthless every single day? Where you blamed me for something I couldn't control? That home?" "You're being dramatic," Marcus said, his tone shifting to the patronizing patience he'd always used when she argued. "Look at you, living in some stranger's house, pretending to be something you're not. Is this really better than what we had?" "Yes," Eulalia said simply. "Because here I'm not broken. I'm not hollow. I'm just Eulalia. And that's enough." Marcus's expression darkened. "You think these people care about you? You're the help, Eulalia. You're cleaning their house and raising their kids, and when they're done with you, they'll throw you out just like I did. The only difference is they'll pay you first." "That's enough," Antonio said, his hand now visibly on the gun beneath his jacket. "You leave. Now." Marcus looked at the gun, at Marco who had moved even closer, and his courage faltered. But before he could retreat, A voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Is there a problem?" Affiano. He appeared from behind them, moving with the kind of fluid grace that suggested he'd been there longer than anyone realized. He wore a long black coat and dark suit, his silver-streaked hair catching the winter light, and everything about him radiated controlled violence. The lion, fully awake. Marcus actually took a step back. "Who are you?" "I'm the man whose children you just insulted," Affiano said quietly. "I'm the man whose employee you just threatened. And I'm the man who's about to give you a choice." He moved to stand beside Eulalia, not quite touching, but close enough that his presence wrapped around her like armor. The boys had gone silent, even Luca, sensing something dangerous in the air. "Choice," Marcus managed, his voice weaker now. "You can walk away right now, forget you ever saw Eulalia, and continue your miserable existence," Affiano said. "Or you can keep talking, and I'll show you what happens to men who disrespect people I protect." The word protect carried the same weight it had at the dinner table. Ownership, territory, consequence. Marcus looked at Eulalia, at Affiano, at the two armed men who had materialized like shadows. His face flushed with humiliation and rage, but survival instinct won over pride. "This isn't over," he said, the threat hollow. "Yes," Affiano replied. "It is. Because if I see you near her again, near my sons again, near anything that belongs to me, you won't walk away. You'll be carried away. Do we understand each other?" Marcus said nothing, but he turned and walked away, his steps quick and uncertain, a man who'd just realized he was outmatched in every way that mattered. The park seemed to exhale. Normal sounds returned. Children laughing, vendors calling, the city living around them. Affiano turned to Eulalia, his hand finally touching her arm. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though she was shaking. "How did you know?" "Antonio called," Affiano said simply. "I was 3 minutes away." 3 minutes. He dropped everything and come running because someone had threatened her. Luca tugged on Affiano's coat. "Papa, who was that man?" "No one," Affiano said, his voice gentler now. "No one who matters." But Dante was watching Eulalia with those calculating eyes, and she knew he'd figured it out. Her past. The reason she'd been barefoot in the snow. The ghost she'd been running from. "Miss Eulalia," Dante said quietly, "are we still getting hot chocolate?" The question was so beautifully, perfectly normal that Eulalia almost cried. Instead, she smiled. "Yes," she said, "with extra marshmallows." As they walked toward the vendor, Nico still holding her hand and Affiano close beside her, Eulalia realized something. Marcus had been right about one thing. She was the help. She was cleaning the house and raising the children. But she was also protected, valued, seen, and that made all the difference. They returned to the estate with hot chocolate warming their hands and the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the snow. The boys were quieter than usual, processing what they'd witnessed in their own ways. Dante walked close to Eulalia, protective in his small, serious manner. Luca held Affiano's hand and chattered about the bean sculpture, filling the silence with determined normalcy. Nico pressed against Eulalia's side, the green parka rustling with each step. Once inside, Mrs. Kovac ushered the boys upstairs for their afternoon lessons, leaving Eulalia and Affiano standing in the foyer. The house felt too quiet after the chaos of the park, the silence heavy with unspoken things. "Come with me," Affiano said, his voice gentle but firm. Not a request. He led her to his study, a room she'd never entered before. It was masculine and spare. Dark wood furniture, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a massive desk that looked like it had witnessed 1,000 decisions, each one carrying weight. The windows overlooked the gardens, now gray and dormant under winter's grip. Affiano closed the door behind them and gestured to one of the chairs. "Sit." Eulalia sat, suddenly aware of how much she was trembling. The adrenaline from the confrontation was finally catching up to her, her hands shaking as she set down her empty cup. Affiano poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter and handed her one. "Drink. It'll help." She took a sip. The whiskey burned going down, but he was right. It helped. He settled into the chair across from her, his elbows on his knees, his attention completely focused on her face. "Tell me about him." "There's nothing to tell," Eulalia said. "You heard him. Ex-husband. It's over. The bruise on your wrist the night I found you," Alfiano said quietly. "The way you flinched when I reached for you in the car. The fact that you were barefoot in December. That's not nothing, Eulalia." She looked down at her hands. The bruise had faded weeks ago, but the memory of how it got there remained. "He never hit me," she said finally. "Not with his fists. But his hands were hard when he was angry. He grabbed my wrist when I tried to leave arguments. Pulled me back when I walked away. Hold me too tight when he wanted me to understand how disappointed he was." Alfiano's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Just waited. I told myself it wasn't abuse because there were no black eyes. No split lips. Just bruises I could hide under long sleeves and explanations I could make to myself. She took another sip of whiskey. "The night he threw me out, he grabbed my arm and dragged me to the door. I fell on the steps. That's how I lost my shoes. They came off when I was trying to get my balance." "And he left you there," Alfiano said. "Not a question. He locked the door and turned off the porch light," Eulalia confirmed. "Like I was trash he'd finally gotten around to taking out." The silence that followed was different. Dangerous. When she looked up, Alfiano's expression was carefully blank, but his eyes held something that made her breath catch. Rage controlled but absolute. "Where does he live?" Alfiano asked, his voice too calm. "Alfiano, no." "Where?" "Does he? Live. I don't want you to do anything," Eulalia said quickly. "He's not worth it. He's just a small, bitter man who doesn't matter anymore." "He put his hands on you," Alfiano said, each word precise and cold. "He threw you into the street in winter. He tracked you down to intimidate you in front of my sons. He matters because he hurt you. And people who hurt, what's mine answer to me?" The possessiveness should have frightened her, should have reminded her of Marcus's controlling grip, but it didn't feel the same. Marcus had owned her like property. Alfiano protected her like treasure. "I don't want you to become a monster because of me," Eulalia said. Alfiano leaned forward, taking the glass from her hands and setting it aside. Then he took both her hands in his grip warm and careful. "I'm already a monster, Eulalia. I've done things that would make you leave if you knew the details. But I choose when and where and why I'm monstrous. And protecting you? That's not monstrosity. That's justice. There's a difference between justice and revenge." "Not in my world," Alfiano said. "In my world, they're the same thing. You make an example so others learn. You show consequences so the message is clear." His thumbs brushed across her knuckles. "Do you trust me?" The question hung between them. Did she trust a man who controlled criminal enterprises, who had enemies that killed innocent women, who wore violence as naturally as he wore expensive suits? But she thought about his hands on his son's shoulders, the way he'd carried her through the snow, the vulnerability in his voice when he spoke about Isabella, the fact that he'd dropped everything and come running when she was threatened. "Yes," she whispered, "I trust you." "Then trust that I know how to handle men like Marcus Pinto," Alfiano said. "Trust that I'll make sure he never bothers you again. And trust that I'm doing this not to cage you, but to free you." He stood, releasing her hands, and moved to his desk. He made a phone call, spoke in rapid Italian, then hung up and returned to her. "It's done," he said simply. "What's done?" "Marcus Pinto will receive a visit tonight. Nothing permanent, nothing that will put him in a hospital. Just a conversation about choices and consequences. By morning, he'll understand that you are untouchable, that your name is spoken with respect or not at all, that the pain he caused you has been noted and balanced." Eulalia stood, her legs unsteady. "I don't know how to feel about this." "You don't have to feel anything," Alfiano said. "This isn't your burden. It's mine. You focus on my sons, on healing, on building the life you deserve. I'll handle the shadows. But I don't want you to be only shadows," Eulalia said. "The boys need more than protection. They need a father who's present, not one who's always fighting battles." "I know," Alfiano said, "which is why I'm finishing this quickly. Marcus Pinto was your past. After tonight, he'll stay there, and then we can all move forward." He moved closer, and Eulalia found herself looking up at him, at the silver in his hair and the ink on his neck and the dark eyes that held more emotion than his face would ever show. You're safe here, he said quietly. Not because I've locked you in, but because I've locked everything else out. There's a difference. Shield, not cage, Eulalia murmured, remembering his words. Exactly, Affiano said. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a loose curl behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. You've given my sons their lives back. Let me give you yours. The touch was electric, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with choice. Eulalia's breath caught, her heart hammering, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. Wanted him to, even though it was complicated and dangerous and probably a terrible idea. But Affiano stepped back, his hand falling away, professional distance sliding back into place. Mrs. Kovac will have dinner ready at 6, he said. The boys will want you there. It was a dismissal, but a gentle one. Eulalia nodded and moved toward the door. With her hand on the handle, she paused. Affiano. Yes. Thank you, she said, for seeing me as something worth protecting. Always, he replied, and she believed him. That night, while Eulalia read stories to Nico and tucked Luca into bed and helped Dante with his mathematics, somewhere across the city Marcus Pinto learned the price of disrespect. She didn't know the details, didn't want to, but when she came downstairs after the boys were asleep, she found Affiano in the library, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring into the fire. Is it done? She asked from the doorway. It's done, Affiano confirmed. He won't bother you again. She crossed the room and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. I know what you are, Eulalia said quietly. The lion. The monster. The man who does terrible things to keep his family safe. And, Affiano asked. And I'm still here, she said, because the man who does terrible things is also the man who makes space at the dinner table, who listens when his sons are scared, who carried a stranger out of the snow because she needed help. Affiano looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, softened. You see too much. Maybe, Eulalia agreed. Or maybe I see exactly enough. They sat in silence, watching the fire burn, and Eulalia realized that protection didn't always mean walls and guns and threats. Sometimes it meant making room for someone to heal. Sometimes it meant taking the shadows so they could stand in the light. The shout came from the hallway, followed by the thunder of small feet. The door burst open and 3 boys tumbled in, excitement radiating from them like sunlight. Did you say yes? Luca demanded, bouncing. Did she say yes? She said yes, Affiano confirmed. Can we call her Mama now? Nico asked, his voice small but clear. Really call her? Eulalia's heart stopped. She looked at Dante, who was watching her with those serious dark eyes, waiting. If you want to, she managed. If you're sure. We're sure, Dante said, with all the gravity of 6-year-old making a life decision. We talked about it. We know you're not our first mama, but you're our mama now. If that's okay. That's more than okay, Eulalia whispered. Mama, Lucas said, testing it out. Then louder, Mama. He crashed into her, arms wrapping around her waist, and Eulalia caught him, pulling him close. Nico followed, quieter but just as certain, pressing against her side. Even Dante, too mature for displays of affection, moved closer and let her rest a hand on his shoulder. Affiano watched from beside the fireplace, and when Eulalia met his eyes over the boys' heads, she saw everything they hadn't said yet, everything that was coming, the complicated future they'd build together, one careful day at a time. But for now, this was enough. 3 boys calling her Mama, a ring that meant belonging, a man who saw her as treasure rather than burden. Group hug, Luca declared, and somehow they all ended up tangled together, laughing and warm and whole. Later, after the boys had run off to play and the house had settled into afternoon quiet, Eulalia stood in the kitchen and looked at the ring on her finger. The silver ring from her grandmother sat in her jewelry box now, treasured but retired. This new ring, heavy and meaningful, caught the light and reminded her of everything she'd survived to get here. Affiano found her there, leaning against the counter, lost in thought. Regrets? He asked. None, Eulalia said. I was just thinking about that night. The bus stop. How certain I was that my story was over. And now I know it was just the end of the wrong story, she said. She turned to face him, this complicated man who'd given her everything by offering her a simple choice. And the beginning of the right one. Affiano moved closer, not quite touching, but near enough that she could feel his warmth. We're a mess, you know. This family. My world. The danger that comes with my name. I know, Eulalia said. And you still want this? Us. She thought about 3 lost boys who called her Mama now. About a fortress that had become a home. About the way fear and love could coexist. How protection and freedom weren't opposites, but partners. I was thrown out by a man who thought I was broken, Eulalia said, and found by a man who saw I was just bent, who gave me space to straighten, who showed me that family isn't about blood or biology. It's about showing up. And that's enough? Affiano asked. That's everything, Eulalia replied. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face, and reached for her hand, the one wearing his ring. Their ring. Welcome home, Eulalia Pinto. I'm already there, she said, and she was.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.